Richard Scolyer, melanoma doctor's high-stakes gamble to treat his brain cancer. On opposite sides of the world, Richard Scolyer and Georgina Long each took one look at a scan and their hearts sank. In front of them was, to the untrained eye, an innocuous-looking brain. But these longtime friends, both leading skin cancer doctors, feared it held a ticking time bomb. Nestled in the top right corner of Professor Scolyer's skull was a section of matter lighter and cloudier than the rest. "I'm no expert in radiology, but in my heart I knew it was a tumor," he tells the BBC. Neurosurgeons soon confirmed it wasn't just any brain tumor, but the worst of the worst, a subtype of glioblastoma so aggressive most patients survive less than a year. Devastated but determined, he and Professor Long set out to do the impossible, to save his life by finding a cure. And it may sound crazy, but the Australian researchers have done it before, with melanoma. "It didn't sit right with me, to just accept certain death without trying something," Professor Scolyer says. "It's an incurable cancer? Well, bugger that." National treasures. 30 years ago, when Professor Scolyer and Professor Long met as bright, young doctors, advanced melanoma was a death sentence. But that's exactly what drew them to it. Australia has long had the highest rate of the skin cancer on the planet, and where many saw a daunting challenge, they saw potential. Back when I was doing the cancer block, the most challenging patients to see were the ones with advanced melanoma. It was heartbreaking, Professor Long says. I wanted to make a difference. Today, it's near impossible to overstate their impact on the field. Anyone who gets a diagnosis or treatment for melanoma worldwide does so because of the work pioneered by the Melanoma Institute that they now lead. Over the past decade, their team's research on immunotherapy, which uses the body's immune system to attack cancer cells, has dramatically improved outcomes for advanced melanoma patients around the world. Half are now essentially cured, up from less than 10%. That breakthrough, or as Professor Long calls it, penicillin moment, is now being applied to many other cancers, saving even more lives. It has made the duo national treasures. Almost every Australian would know someone impacted by their work, and this year they've been jointly named as the Australians of the Year. But as they were transforming the field, they were also leaving their mark on each other. They bonded over frustration at the cases they couldn't crack, the highs of life-changing discoveries, a love of exercise, and a lofty ambition of reaching zero melanoma deaths in Australia. We're very different but very similar in that sort of roll up your sleeves, get things done way, Professor Long says. Eyes shining, the medical oncologist rattles off a list of qualities: brave, honest, upbeat, driven, which make Professor Scolyer the dream colleague and friend. He's a delight, she surmises. And so, after she received that fateful call from Poland last June, where Professor Scolyer was on holiday when a seizure triggered his diagnosis, she spent the night crying. "I'm grieving. I'm thinking my friend is going to be gone in 12 months. But then she spent the morning plotting, poring over textbooks, researching clinical trials, and firing off emails to colleagues globally. Glioblastomas, found in the brain's connective tissue, are notoriously aggressive, and the general protocol for treating them, immediate excision then radiotherapy and chemotherapy, has changed little in 2 decades. Survival rates have fared similarly. Still, only 5% of all patients live beyond 5 years. Desperate, Professor Long formulated a radical plan to treat Professor Scolyer based on what had worked in melanoma, but which had never been tested in brain cancer. Risk versus reward. In melanoma, Professor Long and her team discovered that immunotherapy works better when a combination of drugs are used, and when they are administered before any surgery to remove a tumor. It's like training a sniffer dog, she explains. You give it a smell of the contraband, in this analogy the cancer cells, for it to be able to hunt them down later. Professor Scolyer jokes that trying the treatment was a no-brainer. But it comes with huge risks. Some oncologists were skeptical that the drugs would reach his brain at all, and even if they did, that his immune system would respond. And they worried the experiment could kill him faster. Many brain cancers grow so rapidly that even a 2-week delay to surgery could mean it's too late to operate, they said. Immunotherapy drugs are quite toxic, especially when mixed, so he could be poisoned. And if either of those things caused the brain to swell, he could die instantly. At home, colleagues quietly shared fears Professor Long's emotional ties were clouding her judgment. They were saying, "Just let the neuro-oncology experts do their thing and be his friend," she says. "But he needs us. We have all this depth of knowledge, it's our duty." And so, under the care of Professor Long and a team of experts, Professor Scolyer became the first brain cancer patient to ever have combination pre-surgery immunotherapy. He is also the first to be administered a vaccine personalized to his tumor markers, which boosts the cancer-detecting powers of the drugs. A glimmer of hope. Weeks after that initial scan sent their lives into a tailspin, Professor Scolyer and Professor Long looked at another test result. It was an analysis of the tumor that had been carefully plucked from Professor Scolyer's skull. "I was blown away. In a millisecond," he says. "It was bloody obvious that it is doing something." Not only were there traces of the drugs in the tumor, proving the medication had reached his brain, there was an explosion of immune cells. And they were activated, giving the team hope they would be attacking his cancer cells at that very moment. The average time for a glioblastoma cancer to return is 6 months post-surgery. But 8 months on, after continued immunotherapy, Professor Scolyer is showing no signs of active cancer. Just last week, another scan came back clean and Professor Long says his brain is normalizing. The results so far have generated huge excitement. There's creeping hope that this could prolong Professor Scolyer's life. But there's also optimism that the duo may be on the cusp of a discovery which could help the 300,000 people diagnosed with brain cancer globally each year. You may also be interested in Hunt to uncover story of mysterious shipwreck. What ex-doctor whose showrunner Chris Chibnall did next? Who was William? The forgotten face of a prison tragedy. Line. This kind of research would usually take years, even decades, but what Professor Scolyer and Professor Long have achieved in mere months has already attracted interest from pharmaceutical companies and generated talk of clinical trials. Roger Stupp, though, is more tempered. The doctor, after whom the current protocol for treating glioblastomas is named, says Professor Scolyer's prognosis is grim and that it's too early to tell if this treatment is working. Promising is a difficult word. Encouraging, I would call it, he tells the BBC from Chicago. It's not a revolution, but it is still a step forward. He wants to see Professor Scolyer reach 12 months, even 18, without recurrence before he'll be persuaded. But Dr. Stupp says he is absolutely confident that immunotherapy can change the treatment of brain cancer. The science just hasn't been cracked yet. "We need to get out of our silos and look at what worked in other tumor types," he says. Professor Scolyer and Professor Long are also trying to resist being swept up in the buzz. The best-case scenario is that Professor Scolyer is cured, but they call the odds of that minuscule. A miracle could happen, Professor Scolyer says. As for the worst-case scenario, he tells the BBC he's already beaten it. "I would have died before now." Instead, he celebrated his 57th birthday in December and another Christmas with his family, wife Katie, and his teenage children Emily, Matthew, and Lucy. But with the gratitude for each additional milestone, every clear scan, is the fear it's his last. It's tough, Professor Long says of treating her friend. They've had discussions about death and funerals. He's extraordinarily resilient, she adds. But sitting in his office, surrounded by pictures of his children, tasks scribbled on a whiteboard and shelves filled with framed accolades, Professor Scolyer tears up. For all his outward positivity, he admits he's also scared and soul-crushingly sad. "I love my family. I love my wife. I like my work," he says with a grimace. "I'm pissed off. I'm devastated. I don't want to die." But giving him comfort is the idea that this research could bring meaning, some purpose, to his diagnosis. "The data that we've generated, I know it's changing the field, and if I die tomorrow with that, I'm very proud."